So thank you very much indeed. Yes, Deanna, sorry, beg your pardon. And thank you also to Andrew Whitley, the chair of trustees, who saw me speak last year for the Friends of the Spafford Children's Centre, and then very kindly invited me to speak today. And thanks too to all at the Balfour Project as well for the work they're doing, as Deanna said, to raise awareness of Britain's historic responsibilities in the Middle East. Before I begin, I just want to mark the fact that today is Land Day, commemorating when Israeli forces opened fire on an unarmed protest against settler takeover of the land on the 30th of March, today, in 1976. 6 people were killed and many more injured that day. The same day, 30th of March in 2018, saw the start of border protests in Gaza when Israeli snipers killed 15 people. This talk will not be a scholarly analysis. I'm not a scholar, as you heard from the introduction, looking at international relations over this 200-year period. What I want to do is to offer a fairly brisk and breezy canter through a few of the highlights and the lowlights of the British presence in Jerusalem and in Palestine from the early 19th century until today. It will be partial. It will be biased. It will be imbalanced. And it might even be unbalanced. I'm a freelance, as Deanna said earlier on, I'm a freelance independent writer. I have no institutional affiliations. So what you'll hear is just me speaking for myself. And as such, things might get a little bit angry, but I will, I hope, give a flavor of the roles that this country, Britain, has played. And then I'll end with a few ideas about where we are at the moment. But I'm going to start, if I can, with this chap. And I mean the guy on the left, actually, the guy on the horse, not the noseless chap on the right. The guy on the horse is Napoleon. In 1798 and 1799, Napoleon invaded first Egypt, as you can see, and then Syria, of which Palestine was a part, carving his way northwards until he faced Shazad Pasha at Acre, or Acre. French forces besieged the town, but British troops supported the Ottoman authorities to resist a French takeover. Was this the first British intervention of the modern era? No, of course it wasn't. But it's as good a place as any to start, I think, with 2 external powers conducting hostilities toe-to-toe in a Palestinian theatre of confrontation. And Napoleon also pops up in the story again in a short while. To get there and to focus in on Jerusalem, I want to start with a theme from my recent book about Jerusalem. Now, here are 2 images of the old city of Jerusalem, which, as I'm sure everybody on this webinar will know, is the historic walled area at the center of the city where not all, but most of the holy places are. I've taken these images from the news media, but they're very similar to maps that we might see as outsiders in a tourist guide or in tourist office literature in some way. They invariably show the old city divided into 4: Muslim quarter, Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter. And very often with these sharp, clear lines of division between them as well. But as anybody who's been to the old city of Jerusalem will know, there are no dividing lines between, say, the Christian quarter and the Muslim quarter. That line on the map is just a street. It's a market street. It's 3 or 4 meters wide. It's very busy, very lively. There are people on both sides. There are shops on both sides. There aren't really both sides. It's just a street. The sense of exclusivity that these maps on the screen bring across is quite wrong. There are churches In the Muslim quarter, there are mosques. In the Jewish quarter, there are people living everywhere. But somebody approaching Jerusalem for the first time might imagine, seeing these maps, that these four quarters are somehow holy. This is a holy city. Has it been divided into holy quarters? It's a mistake. But from that mistake, it's then a short step to the next mistake, which is thinking that perhaps Christians aren't even allowed into the Muslim quarter, or that Jews may not enter the Armenian quarter. So then you have a situation where a Christian outsider, a visitor, might be thinking that the Muslim quarter is somehow enemy territory. It's not my place. I should stay away. The whole thing is wrong, quite wrong, and very misleading. It's a very Western conception. These maps are rooted in ideas of the nation state. To me, with my cultural references, they look like an atlas of Europe, where all the nations sort of lock together very neatly along these borderlines. And it also strikes me of reminding me of a map of the United States. In the west of the United States, there's a point where Utah and Colorado and Arizona and New Mexico all meet together at a four corners point. And that's particularly the image on the right there. That's very instructive as well, of course, because what's invisible in that formulation are the Native American lands of, in that instance, the Navajo people and the Hopi people and others, which were erased by the US state borders. And in a similar way, in the Jerusalem context, these maps, which are so familiar to us, erase an indigenous reality of the city. So where did this idea come from? All through the medieval period, Jerusalem was depicted in this sort, as you can see on the screen, sort of idealized form, often as a perfect circle, which is drawn from a biblical reference, or as a kind of imagined European-style fortress. Arabic sources, though, speak of Jerusalem as a mixed cluster of neighborhoods. One historian speaks of 39 quarters of Jerusalem in the 13th, 14th century. Another one describes 18 quarters in 1495. These are organic. These are neighborhoods that developed from the bottom up. And that situation lasted through to Napoleon, who we met earlier on, who, as well as military forces, brought with him artists, scholars, scientists, explorers, cartographers. Very shortly afterwards, we see the first map of Jerusalem based on, not on these idealized forms, but based on measurements taken in the field. This is it, from 1818. There's a lot to say about this map. It's a fascinating document. But focusing on the story that I'm telling now, what I've highlighted is the only label on the map referring to ethno-religious settlement within the city. And the label is Judenstadt, or Jewish area, Jewish city, Jewish quarter. This one on the screen now is the next major advance in the mapping of Jerusalem. This is from 1835. This is the English explorer, Frederick Catherwood, who drew this. And again, there's lots to say. It's a very interesting map to analyze. Looking at the story I'm telling, the only quarter label again is Jews' quarter. And this period, the 1830s, was a time of political upheaval in Jerusalem and in all of Palestine. There had been a rebellion led from Egypt, which had challenged Ottoman rule. There was a popular uprising in Palestine itself, which led to a power vacuum. European powers were present, were jockeying for position, trying to restore order, but also trying to take advantage of the instability to advance their own interests as well. This is a period when we see foreign consulates opening for the first time in Jerusalem, including the British consulate in 1839. And then the following year, after a failed diplomatic initiative, Britain intervened militarily. It essentially bombed Palestine and returned Palestine back to Ottoman control, but British forces remained. There was a team of Royal Engineers who were tasked with surveying the terrain of Palestine up and down the coast. And then in 1841, two of them surveyed Jerusalem. But that conflict of 1840 wasn't just about geopolitics. British Protestant evangelical missionaries had long had their eye on the unevangelized people of the Ottoman Empire. They were unable to convert Muslims, because Ottoman law stipulated death for people who converted away from Islam. They were unable to convert Catholics or Orthodox Christians, partly because there was little willingness in those communities to convert, and partly because France protected Catholic rights and Russia protected Orthodox rights. And this left Britain out in the cold somewhat. They had nobody to protect. Britain wanted a religious excuse to intervene in Jerusalem and a diplomatic excuse to seek privileges from the Sultan to match the privileged status of France and Imperial Russia. There had long been, and there still is, a strain in evangelical thinking that sees the conversion of the Jews as being a prelude to the second coming of Christ. So at this time, we see all British efforts going into converting the Jews to Christianity and then serving as their diplomatic protector and the protector of all Protestants in Jerusalem, all of which meant that the Brits needed to know exactly who lived where. Britain appointed the first Protestant bishop of Jerusalem, a man called Michael Alexander, who appropriately enough was formerly a rabbi, and he converted to Christianity. He arrived in 1842. With him was a young chaplain, a man called George Williams, who was aged 27 at this time. He was only in Jerusalem just over a year or so. Then he was posted elsewhere. In 1849, he published a new edition of his book, as you can see on the screen, The Holy City. And it included a map, which had been drawn from the Royal Engineers Survey of a few years previously, but Williams added all the labeling to it, including Christian quarter, Armenian quarter, Jewish quarter, Muslim quarter. As far as I can tell, George Williams was the instigator of the idea of dividing Jerusalem into 4 quarters. Maps before him didn't show them. And just about every single map ever made since has shown them. There's a direct line from George Williams in 1849 to the maps of Jerusalem that we all see and use today, reinforced in the media and in literature, in guidebooks, on tourist maps, in every conceivable medium. Why has this idea of 4 quarters survived? Well, as the work of an increasing number of historians, people like Salim Tamari, Vincent Lemire, Michel Campos, Sarah Irving, Roberto Mazza, and others as well, whose work is the foundation of anything that I've done myself, as they are now showing, it survived because it suits the colonial ambitions of successive waves of the rulers of Jerusalem, right down to our own time. These 4 quarters are false. They were invented by a 19th century British old Etonian missionary. They always were false, but it suited Jerusalem's colonizers to divide the city's populations against themselves, to foster sectarian division. But Jerusalem, in reality, wasn't divided. Populations had always clustered. Christian communities would cluster near their church, or particular tradespeople would live and work in close proximity, or sometimes people who had arrived in Jerusalem from another location would stick together. But the exclusivity, and particularly the sectarian exclusivity expected by the British and others, wasn't there. If you remember the 39 quarters of Jerusalem in the 13th, 14th century, and the 18 quarters in 1495, the area within the walls is not large, less than half a square mile. And we have dozens or hundreds of accounts of Muslims and Christians and Jews living in the same neighborhoods, even sometimes in the same buildings, rubbing along, sometimes more smoothly, sometimes less smoothly, but sharing this very limited space together. On the screen, I put an image of a book called The Storyteller of Jerusalem, with a picture on the cover of the musician and the diarist Wasif Jauhariya. He lived after George Williams. This is a marvelous book. If you people on this webinar may well know it. If you don't know it, do get hold of a copy. It's remarkable. Jauhariya's diaries evoke the ordinary life of Jerusalem in a time several years, a few decades after George Williams, as I said. But the Palestinian scholar Salim Tamari, who edited the diaries for publication, wrote about the evidence offered by Jauheria of a city in which, as he says on the screen, the social structure was much more fluid than is generally believed. The picture that Jauheria paints in the late Ottoman period is of a dynamic social mix in which religious festivities were shared across confessional lines, in which layered identities refute this British imposed notion of exclusivity. But the British themselves had little idea of any of this. Their evangelizing mission and the general expansion of Protestantism in Jerusalem is inextricably linked with the expansion of British colonial intervention. This on the screen is William Thomson, who was Archbishop of York, and he's speaking in 1865 to a public meeting in London. Quote, "This country of Palestine belongs to you and to me. It is essentially ours. That land has been given unto us." And he goes on, quote, "It's a sacred duty to rescue from darkness and oblivion much of the history of that country," unquote. So now we know Palestine belongs to the Archbishop of York. Perhaps His Grace might like to step in and run the place for a while. Anyway, Laura Robson, who's a professor of history at Penn State University, can shed some light on this. She writes, quote, "The evangelical Protestant worldview did a great deal to determine the nature of the encounter between the British and the local Arab populations in 19th century Palestine. It determined the British focus on local Christian and Jewish populations rather than the much larger Arab Muslim community. Furthermore, it assisted the emergence of an understanding of Palestine as a place whose significance lay primarily in its Christian and Jewish heritage, an idea that would be used from the mid-19th century onwards to legitimize a British political claim to the so-called Holy Land. The British understood their presence in Palestine not in relation to Palestine's inhabitants, but in relation to Christian theological debates and great power politics," unquote. Those internalized assumptions about what Jerusalem and Palestine mean still persist. We can see them in flawed declarations and skewed policymaking right up until today. The British intervention in Palestine rests on what we now call today Christian Zionism, which is espoused by large parts of the American political establishment, particularly on the right. Broadly, it rests on the belief, as I've mentioned, that widespread conversion of Jews to Christianity, coupled with the ingathering of Jews to Israel and the restoration of Jewish rule in the Holy Land, I'm using quotes around those terms, is a necessary precondition for the second coming of Jesus, the end times, and the rapture. As such, and despite the fact that it brings vast wealth and influence to Israel, and so has long been enthusiastically supported by successive Israeli governments of all stripes, despite that, Christian Zionism is essentially anti-Semitic. It singles out Jewish people and Jewish identity and culture, and it sees them simply as a vehicle by which Christian theological and political goals can be advanced. It advocates, as does Zionism itself, the elimination of diaspora, the uprooting of Jewish communities wherever they exist in the world and their transfer to Israel. Having singled out Jews, Christian Zionism targets only them for conversion. And though its home today is America, Christian Zionism was originated and most fully expressed in the 19th century by British elites. I've put on the screen the cover of a book by Gabriel Polly, a recent book from 2020, which focuses on some of these issues. And it's around this time, in the middle of the 19th century, that we see the first appearance of that notorious phrase, a land without a people for a people without a land, which was articulated for the first time in 1843 by this person on the screen, Church of Scotland clergyman Alexander Keith, and repeated countless times thereafter, down to our own time, by those seeking to erase Palestine's Arab heritage in favor of Jewish settlement. This contempt also extended to the missionaries' own co-religionists in Palestine. Evangelical rhetoric at this time commonly referred to the region's Orthodox communities as nominal Christians. One writer said, quote, who are in a state of deplorable ignorance and degradation, bewildered with strong delusions, unquote. And so therefore in need of salvation through evangelical conversion. Unsurprisingly then, the British intervention in this period was, as we would characterize it using the terms of today, a fundamentally racist, supremacist endeavor, anti-Semitic, and Islamophobic. In the second half of the 19th century, Protestant efforts to prove the historicity of the Bible became entwined with Protestant skepticism about the veracity of Christian holy places in Jerusalem, specifically, as on the screen, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre itself. As I'm sure many people on this webinar will know from firsthand experience, the church is a messy and a confusing space. It's shared between the Greek, Armenian, Catholic, Syriac, Coptic, and Ethiopian churches. It's dark, gloomy, it's full of incense and ritual and overlapping worship. It's the absolute antithesis of what 19th century British and other European Protestants wanted or expected from the house of God. And here is what some of them said about it. They read in their Bibles about Jesus being crucified outside the city wall at a place with a garden. And they looked at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is bang in the middle of the city, guarded by Muslim doorkeepers and soldiers, and where multitudes of Orthodox and Catholic priests hold sway, with their own reformed and enlightened churches excluded. And they thought they deserved better. And never mind that the route of Jerusalem's walls have obviously shifted over the centuries, and that the topography has been altered many, many times. That wasn't good enough. All these deplorably ignorant nominal Christians had got it wrong, and modern scientific methods should be employed to identify the proper site of the crucifixion. There are many people who could tell this part of the story. I'm just going to go with one on the screen. Major General Charles Gordon fought in the Crimean War, and he was nicknamed Chinese Gordon for his suppression of popular uprisings in China. He died in action in Sudan, after which he was re-nicknamed Gordon of Khartoum. Before that, he spent a year in Jerusalem in 1883, and as an enthusiastic evangelical, he too disliked the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and he proposed that the tomb of Jesus, in fact, lay north of the city walls at the site of a small hill and a garden. The idea electrified Protestant opinion, despite the fact that it was wrong. The site became known as Gordon's Calvary, and a British charity bought it in 1894, and they still run it today under the name of the Garden Tomb. It's a lovely place to sit. And for lots of visiting Christian pilgrims, it feels right, even though they know it isn't. I find it a difficult place to understand. Anyway, now we've reached the turn of the 20th century and the last gasps of Ottoman rule. The received wisdom is that the Ottoman Empire by this stage had become what's called the sick man of Europe, decadent, hidebound, hopelessly neglectful of Palestine and especially of Jerusalem, which the Ottomans allowed simply to decay into a poorly governed backwater. In truth, what do we actually have? We have a city, Jerusalem, that had a representative municipal council established in 1863. Extensive building and rebuilding work going on under regulated urban planning and urban engineering. Sewers and public sanitation improving from the 1880s onwards. A municipal hospital open to all. The introduction of electricity. A professional police force established in 1886. Tourism through the roof, with a city that had links of trade and commerce with Damascus and Beirut and Cairo and Haifa and Jaffa and the European world as well. Jerusalem was an economically active international city that was garnering international attention. This on the screen is what one recent historian, Roberto Mazza, has written. He says, quote, Jerusalem's Ottoman municipality was very dynamic, focusing not only on the modernization of the city, but also on the well-being of its inhabitants. Despite its limits and its problems, it was an arena for public discussion, aiming to involve the inhabitants, a space for negotiation rather than the polarization of interests, unquote. So much for the idea of a decaying backwater. I'd like you to remember, if you can, that line, aiming to involve all the inhabitants, because it will become relevant shortly. But of course, we know Ottoman rule was doomed, soon to be replaced by the British. This is a nice little visual story that spans that transition. All through the 19th century, the Ottoman authorities had been building clock towers in cities around the empire. Part of it was about accuracy, being able to call the prayer correctly. But it was also about modernization and improving public space for all, beyond the traditional self-interests of sect. Jerusalem's clock tower went up in 1909, directly over the very center of the modern city, the place we know in English as Jaffa Gate. The tower, as you can see, was tall and fluted, this sort of hybrid of Turkish and European Baroque, designed by a local municipal architect. By all accounts, Jerusalemites loved it. It had four faces. The east and the west faces showed European time as we would understand it. But the north and the south faces showed Ottoman Islamic time, which meant that every day at the sunset prayer time, the hands would be manually reset to show 12 o'clock. This was advanced technology, if you like, conceived to glorify the Sultan and his imperial leadership, but deployed in the service of the people. And then in 1917, the British General Edmund Allenby strode into Jerusalem through Jaffa Gate in this, as you can see on the screen, this stage-managed display of imperial conquest, with the clock tower prominent behind him. Almost immediately, the British hated it. And this is some of the things that were said about the clock tower at the time on the screen. But this is geopolitical maneuvering dressed up as an issue of taste. The subtext was that the British officials, flushed with this victory in war, couldn't stomach such a reminder of the Ottoman presence over the very center of the city. They hated the clock tower as a symbol of profane communalism in a city that they conceived of as sacred, inviolable, a monument to Christian supremacy. So they demolished it, just like that. They assumed nobody would complain, but the outcry was so great that even Jerusalem's new colonial masters were forced to recant, and British officials took the mechanism of the old clock and they reinstalled it in this stubby tower, which they built themselves in 1926, not over Jaffa Gate, but away and outside the walls. Jerusalem's new clock tower now rose above, you can see this mini parade of shop fronts. The style is, to me, very odd. This sort of, it's a mix of European modernism with Arab pastiche, all these arches and these strange decorative little domes. It's a pure vision of British Orientalism, regressive and incomprehensible. But it too was doomed. After a few years, the British pulled it down again because it got in the way of the traffic, they said. So Jerusalem had its clock tower for only 25 years, 1909 to 1934. And they were 25 terrible years marked by deepening intercommunal violence, with colonial misgovernance contributing first to social collapse and then eventually to war. And still today, when you stand at Jaffa Gate, if you know the story of the clock tower, you can see the hole in the sky left by the vain British desire to reshape Jerusalem in the image of their own assumptions. Now we are into the British occupation and the Mandate period. Vast amounts have been written about this time, which lasted 30 years, from 1917 to 1948. I will only scrape the surface. And for an overview, I defer to the Jerusalemite Palestinian writer John Talil, who sadly died only a few years ago. And he wrote, quote, "In 1917, when they arrived in Jerusalem, British troops distributed sugar and chocolate. And when they left in 1948, they spread chaos and bitterness," unquote. That souring of goodwill and trust, which lingers to this day, I should add, is rooted in a trio of contradictory promises that Britain gave to the people of the region, the consequences of which we still live with. Very briefly, first, in 1915, Britain promised the Arab leadership that they would support the creation of an Arab state, free from Turkish rule, independent, that would stretch from Aleppo in the north to Yemen in the south. Second, ignoring that, Britain colluded in secret with France to carve up the Middle East between themselves into puppet states under French and British influence. And these are largely the imposed borders that we live with today. And then third, in 1917, the British government issued the Balfour Declaration, expressing support for the creation of a, quote, national home for the Jewish people, unquote, in Palestine. The phrase national home had no precedent. It was not a sort of a recognized term in international law. It still isn't. It was left deliberately vague to mean whatever anyone wanted it to mean. And the declaration included the stipulation that nothing should prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities. And those existing non-Jewish communities, in fact, amounted to 92% of the population. But they had been reduced in this text to an afterthought. As we have seen in the last 6 or 7 years, since the rise of Brexit and Trump and the radicalization of Britain's Conservative Party, adherence to morality in public office and truth really, really do still matter. These three mutually exclusive promises that Britain gave led to a sense of betrayal and a loss of trust, which still hangs around the perception of Britain in the Middle East today. And the framers of those promises were explicitly clear, as on the screen here. Quote, "In the case of Palestine," this is Balfour himself writing in 1919, "we deliberately decline to accept the principle of self-determination. We do not propose even to go through the form of consulting the wishes of the present inhabitants of the country. Zionism is of far profounder import than the desires and prejudices of the 700,000 Arabs who now inhabit Palestine," unquote. Earlier on, if you remember, I mentioned the Ottoman municipality. You might recall Roberto Mazza's description of it as a space for negotiation aiming to involve the inhabitants. The contrast between that and this could not be more stark. Demolishing that Ottoman clock tower and replacing it with their own was a highly symbolic act by the British. And of course, you know, at this time, colonialism was not the dirty word that it is today. And even the early Zionists explicitly described themselves and their project as colonial. But the British political leadership were driven by bigotry. That includes Winston Churchill, who said, in reference to the Palestinians, quote, "I do not agree that the dog in a manger has the final right to the manger, even though he may have lain there for a very long time." And Churchill went on, "I do not admit, for instance, that a great wrong has been done to, as he called them, the Red Indians of America or the black people of Australia by the fact that a stronger race, a higher grade race, a more worldly wise race has come in and taken their place." The colonial presence warped and distorted Jerusalem society, introducing elements of class, sectarianism, racism, violence, hopelessness, and political inertia that are still felt today. And that was exacerbated by methods of enforcement. In Palestine, as elsewhere in Kenya and in Burma, Britain's colonial police weren't exactly famed for their sensitivity and their caring approach. From 1922, the British-run Palestine police recruited around 650 young men from the Black and Tans, which was an auxiliary police force that had been used to try and crush popular uprisings in Ireland and to prevent establishment of what became the Irish Republic. And the Black and Tans were notoriously brutal. Their tactics in Ireland included home demolitions, destruction of entire villages, arbitrary arrests, imprisonment without warrant or charge, beatings, torture, rape, and more. Most were veterans of the World War I trenches, and they imported their trauma to Palestine. One example was this psychopathically brutal and deeply disturbed individual, Douglas Duff, who rose to become Jerusalem's police inspector, where, as he says in the passage at the top, he scarcely regarded the people of the city as human. He was famed for carrying a wooden club, and a Colt 45 pistol, and a whip, and using them all without restraint to enforce his idea of discipline. He waterboarded prisoners. He hoisted people by their limbs until they confessed. And he was eventually dismissed for acts of torture. And then, bizarrely, in retirement, he became a children's author and was a TV panelist on the game show What's My Line, as you can see on the screen. Wherever Duff went, violence followed. And we can say the same for the British in Palestine, 1920, 1929, 1936, 1948. British rule was marked by bloodshed. Was that violence inevitable? Without wishing to be naive, violence is never inevitable. There is always a better option. You just need the political will to identify it and pursue it. Britain had no such will. The calamity of Britain's rule in Palestine and the irresponsibility of its ending, where after 30 years of violence, Britain simply walked away, demands an apology that has not yet been forthcoming. And I should make clear, blame is not the point, and guilt is also not the point. Taking responsibility is what matters. And as for Britain's more recent role, post-1967, post-Intifada, post-Oslo, there are many, many people on this webinar who are far better placed to shed light on that, both as observers of events and also in some cases as participants. But I will, if I may, at this point, jump forward just to offer a couple of thoughts on where we are now. First, we need to accept that the two-state solution is no more. As the scholar Seth Anziska has shown, Israel, with outside help, prevented it from happening. And furthermore, in the last 6 or 7 years, we've seen the occupation and ideas of peace have become peripheral to Israeli politics. Jewish religious parties in Israel have tacked heavily rightwards. Very broadly, international boycotts, although they remain an important tool, have failed to impact Israel's economy. And quite the reverse, actually, with the economic boost from trade agreements with the Gulf states and others. We see instead the entrenchment of a one-state reality, but in the form of an undemocratic, Jewish supremacist one state. And the end of two states, I should add, is not necessarily a cause for pessimism. Partition has almost always heralded disaster. Ireland is the most egregious example, close to home, but you could also consider Pakistan and India in 1947, Pakistan again, and Bangladesh in 1971, Cyprus, Korea, Yugoslavia, post-war Germany, Vietnam. In every case, partition sparked violence, trauma, misery, and in every case, partition failed to solve the underlying issues, which continued and in some cases still continue to rumble. Yet many respected figures still call for partition. Earlier this month, the British MP Layla Moran again urged the British government to recognize the state of Palestine on the pre-1967 borders. Now, I hold great and sincere respect for the invaluable and groundbreaking work of Ms. Moran and others, but these calls, I believe, are mistaken. To begin with, they're too easy for the British government to resist. As the government minister who answered Layla Moran with a couple of dismissive lines showed. Let me be clear, Britain should, of course, recognize the state of Palestine, and it should do so today. But tying that demand to the 1967 borders is, I believe, an error. As Ms. Moran has pointed out, Israel's borders, for the most part, are not defined or agreed internationally, and neither should Palestine's be yet, or at least not as a prerequisite for recognition. Two states are not a solution. They are a fig leaf. They will not solve the core injustice. And the people who will have to live with two states know that. Recent joint Palestinian-Israeli polling suggests that partition has the support of less than a third of Palestinians and roughly the same proportion of Jewish Israelis. There is no trust, not from Palestinians in their leadership, not from Israelis in theirs, and not from either party in each other. 3/4 of Palestinian people think that partition is no longer feasible. Britain still sees the Palestinian Authority as a government in waiting, yet most Palestinians think that it serves Israel's interests and want to see the back of it. The key statistic remains denial of reality. The occupation profoundly harms Palestinian people. That's a fact. Yet only a third of Jewish Israelis accept it. And another third believe that the occupation doesn't harm Palestinians at all. That's a marker of the effectiveness with which Israel has segregated its society and censored its media, keeping Palestinian life and Palestinian reality out of sight and out of mind. On the other side, 2/3 of Palestinians fear that Jewish Israelis want to expel them from the country en masse. But I suppose we can be thankful that only 1 in 5 of Jewish Israelis say that that's actually what they really want. Take 10 people at random from across Israel and Palestine. 9 of them will regard themselves not just as victims, but as the only victims of the situation. 9 out of 10 embrace victimhood for themselves and deny the trauma of others. This one statistic tells us that personal empathy and therefore reconciliation is far away. And sure enough, in the polling, the idea of establishing a single democratic state for all attracts less than 25% support. So political scientists and others discuss federation, which is, I'm sorry to say, a non-starter, and confederation, which demands partition as a prerequisite, and other proposals as well. I would respectfully suggest that morality and political practicality say that the expansion of democracy to all and full participation in a pluralistic society is the only solution that has the chance to hold for the long term. Justice demands equality, and partition is not equality. Anything such as partition that falls short of equality is doomed not only to fail, but to elicit more and bloodier violence along the way and to embed deeper and deeper trauma down the generations. And I should add, if the argument against democracy for all in a single state is that one constituency, Jewish people, would never accept it and would only ever embrace degrees of theocracy or authoritarianism or dictatorship in order to preserve their own supremacy, well, I would say something along the lines of such intolerance should not be tolerated, and the path to peace must then circle around it. I want to end by refocusing on Britain. For many Jews, and especially British Jews, and even within my own British Jewish family, the Balfour Declaration is an act of friendship, expressing the noblest of values. But that emotional attachment can be deceptive, because what the Balfour Declaration did was to validate Herzl's abstract, ungrounded theorizing. And over the last 100 years, it has steered many Jewish people, perhaps even most Jewish people, into imagining themselves to be a nation, and thus to be hoodwinked by the delusion of nationalism. 19th and especially 20th century nationalism is steeped in blood, perpetuating the nationalist mirage today among Jews inside and outside Israel, demands a crippling depth of cognitive dissonance. To celebrate the Balfour Declaration, we have to close our minds to the wider truth, which is that its legacy and Britain's legacy as a whole is blood. Sometimes ours, whoever we are, sometimes theirs, but always blood and trauma and injustice. Balfour's declaration, as I hope I've made clear, was born of colonial high-handedness, anti-Semitism, and betrayal. It had no one's interest at heart but its framers, and they, of course, chose to ignore the people it affected before committing to it. The British government of today continues to make the same mistake. The current Israeli prime minister could be called many things, but Democrat wouldn't necessarily be one of them, not on my list anyway. European countries and even the United States are now sounding clear warnings about the direction of travel in Israel. Yet the British government still chooses to ally itself more and more closely with Mr. Netanyahu and his regime of extremists and agitators than with those who seek democratic outcomes. Why? It seems British ruling conservatives have lost sight of the imperative to improve lives here or anywhere else. They've shown themselves to be happy jumping into bed with a government in which one minister has been convicted of supporting a terrorist organization and another minister openly espouses ethnic cleansing. Add this to the long list of international embarrassments that they have bequeathed Britain over the last decade or so. In the words of Sarah Husseini, who is director of the British Palestinian Committee, quote, "It has long been the case that British policy towards Israel has been at odds with a supposed commitment to a rules-based order and respect for human rights," unquote. This country's populist right is aligning itself ever more closely with Israel's populist right. Neither has learned anything from history. In conclusion, Jerusalem and its people have suffered too long. A recognition of British responsibility, let alone an apology, would go a long way towards starting to rebuild the trust that we have squandered and to restore hope in at least reaching for democratic equality. But with the current crop of political no-hopers in charge, it's unlikely to materialize. I'm fearful that the turbulence of the last 2 centuries looks set to continue into a third. And I wish it were different. Thank you very much indeed for your time and attention today. Deanna, I'm very happy to come back to you for a Q&A.
Hello. Thank you so much for that. That was so interesting. I didn't know anything about the clock tower, and I was wondering whether that, if it was still there, would have made us better at timekeeping, but I doubt it. So
maybe it would have made us better at intercommunal relations, possibly, but if no one to get too idealistic about it, but yeah.
I just want to say we've got some amazing people joining the webinar today. We've got Avi Schleim, who we love. Hello, Avi. And
thank you so much for coming, Avi.
Yeah, Arthur Goodman from Jews for Justice for Palestinians.
Thank you again.
Ilan Baruch, who recently came over as a part of a delegation and was the Israeli ambassador to South Africa, who did a talk for us recently as well. John Cope, Lord Cope from works with Pal Music and the Spafford Center, obviously his wife. So I can't name them all. There's so many amazing people who've joined us today.
Thank you.
Lots of really lovely comments in the chat box. Like I said, I will be sharing the chat box with Matthew afterwards. So if you have any comments for him, lots of people saying it was a brilliant, engrossing talk. Gareth Davies, definitely the best book I read last year. And thank you for the bookmark.
Wow, lovely. That's great. Thank you so much, Gareth.
So we're already on the hour time, so I'm gonna, if you don't
sorry
mind,
if I talk too long. Sorry.
No, we've thoroughly enjoyed it. But I will go for a couple of minutes of questions. I've got some really good ones. So I would like to ask one from Heather Formaney, who I should say is a psychologist, writer as well, and who used a good part of one of your talks for a presentation to the psychiatric community, because it was so fascinating.
That's wonderful to hear. Thank you so much. This is gold. As a writer sitting alone in my little office, to have this feedback coming personally is wonderful. Thank you so much for responding so positively.
Because it will do your ego wonders, because everyone
it's too much. My head is puffing already.
Well, she says, I would love to know if Matthew would like to propose a series of documentaries about his work on Jerusalem. It seems to me it could really help people in Great Britain to understand their own history in relation to Palestine and more specifically to Jerusalem. And thank you for his wonderful work.
Thank you very much. I would love to, if there's any TV, movie, film, radio, whoever, media producers out there, I'd be delighted. Yes. The way that things work tends to be that demand comes from the powers that be rather than from people like me. But if there's a way to bring those two together, I'd be delighted to.
Well, if we've got anyone in that industry watching, then make it happen for us, because we would love to. Yeah, so, and then I'm going to end on a final question. But first, I'm going to get my begging hat out, as I always do at the end. We do these webinars for free because we think that the spreading of this information and educating people on different issues with regards to the issue of Israel-Palestine, super important. We put the recordings on our website, and we really ask that you share the webinars with anyone that you think that might be interested. Let's get the word out there. Let's get this education levels up on this topic and give people more sort of the facts and the figures and the information that they need to go forth and talk about this issue as well. I think is really important. We do all of this for free because we want it to be accessible for as many people. We do have paid events, but our webinar series is free. So if you can help us by giving us a donation, the cost of a coffee, we always say, that would be fantastic. Better yet, if you can sign up to be a friend of the Balfour Project, that involves signing up for a regular giving amount of any amount, either a monthly amount or an annual amount, whatever you prefer, then you become a friend of the Balfour Project. And what that means is that really helps us with admin costs, with financial security. If we get more friends on board, then we can plan our activities much better. We have security in terms of where our income is coming so that we can continue with our charitable works. But as a friend, you get some advantages. You get some free events like our film screenings. We had some amazing ones last year. We've got some amazing ones lined up for this year. More information to follow. And also you get discounted tickets for things like our conference. So the ticket is £25, but I believe it's £15 for friends. So there are benefits to being friends. We also do every couple of months a friends meeting with a couple of people from the Balfour Project, trustees, executive committee, et cetera, and a limited amount of friends so that we can properly have a little chat and get some feedback from the friends, tell them what we're up to. It's a really, really nice little dialogue situation. We've had 2 so far. We're going to have another one soon. So please do consider signing up to be a friend. I'm going to post those links in the chat box now, and then I'm going to go to our final question. I'm really sorry because you have had, as you can imagine, so many questions and we have just not got the time for them. We never do. So, right. So
I should add, if anyone does want to ask me a question, you can contact me. I'm very contactable. You can Google my name. You'll find me. My website is there. Drop me a line.
A link in the chat box to your website. We will be putting we'll be sending an email out hopefully tonight, if not tomorrow morning, with the link to the recording, the link to your past webinar that you did for us, and also your website so people can find out more about you, contact you, your book, and so forth. So if you do have a burning question from Matthew, he's just given you permission to contact him.
Please do.
But my final question is from Abe Hayim. How can we stop the erasure of all other residents of the Old City, Jerusalem Old City, by the extreme encroachment of Israeli settlers and religious groups?
How can we stop? Crikey. That's an easy one to end with. Dear, oh dear.
Well, because we didn't get many questions, I thought I'd go with some big hitters.
Okay, fine. That's given me a little bit of thinking time. I would suggest that the way to stop, there isn't a clear way to stop, obviously, but what can help is expanding understanding and knowledge of what's actually going on. What we receive, particularly in the West, is a narrative that's like that. It's sort of I'm characterizing as 90-10 in this direction. So most of the news media and the channels of communication will focus on an Israeli narrative. What I was trying to do in the book is to turn that into the other 90-10 the other way. And I would suggest, a way to increase pressure, which is going to be the way that the encroachment stops in the Old City of Jerusalem, is by publicizing as much as possible on social media, with friends, in other ways, whatever you can, to try and sort of bring critical thinking to coverage of Israel and coverage of Palestinian affairs in the media as it's presented to us. It's a fluffy answer because there isn't anything concrete and tangible that I would say, do this and it will solve the issue. But this that we need to do is to redress the imbalance in narratives, and to bring, what I was trying to do was to amplify the voices of Palestinians who live in Jerusalem. My voice is unimportant in this. I'm lucky to have a platform as a journalist from which to speak, but I can use that to help amplify the voices of the people who live there. That's, I believe, part of the way to start to address that imbalance in narratives. And that's, I think, what we all can do in our own way, is to acknowledge that what we get is out of whack.
Well, like I said, it's a Palestinian Jerusalem. I myself love the book, so I really recommend it.
Thank you so much.
Had such lovely comments in the chat box, honestly.
That's so nice. I'm so pleased. Thank you.
Thank you for your book. I've already sent copies to 4 people and I'm about to send more. Yes, share the word.
Wow.
From Angela, I love Matthew's book. I have nearly finished it and I shall be sorry when I get to the end.
Oh no. Well, so, start again, maybe, not that I want to, flog a dead horse or anything, but, go back to the beginning.
Or work on that documentary.
There you go.
And I've got a message from Alistair Burke. So he is the former UK, Middle East and North Africa minister. So just would like to read what he says. I thought it was an excellent and really thought-provoking exposition. Thank you. History is one thing, analysis another, but solutions are altogether different. I understand entirely why you conclude as you do, but I'm not sure one state works however you draw it. But I share your view that it's more in the frame than in the past. I expect to continue working on all this, but I'm better informed as a result of your talk and your book. I hope we can meet up.
That's very generous. I would love to. I was just going to say, I'm very happy to continue the discussion and to be persuaded otherwise as well. I'm coming from a very limited direction of one person's knowledge, but the more discussion that we have, the better it is.
Well, I'll definitely introduce you. So if you don't already have his details. So
I don't. So,
Balfour Project, bringing people together. Fantastic. Well, on that note, we're
Thank
going to call it a day on this webinar. Thank you again so much, everyone, for attending. Matthew, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Deanna, as well. I'm very, very appreciative for the opportunity.
It's been fantastic. We really, really enjoyed it. So all the best. Have a lovely evening, everyone. And we will see you at our next one. Bye.
Thanks so much.